The first time I saw a grown man cry over ice cream, I was 22 years old, standing guard at Camp Concordia in Kansas. It was July 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 2 months, but for me, the war was just beginning to make sense. His name was Klaus. At least, that's what his uniform said. He stood there in the July heat, his Wehrmacht jacket stripped of its insignia, staring at the cone in his hand like it was something holy. Vanilla ice cream melting down his fingers, dripping onto the dusty ground. He didn't eat it. He just stared. Then the tears came, silent and steady, cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. I didn't understand it then. How could I? I was from Iowa. Ice cream was Tuesday nights after dinner. Ice cream was county fairs and birthday parties. Ice cream was nothing. But to Klaus, standing there in the Kansas sun with the taste of America melting in his mouth, ice cream was everything he'd forgotten the world could be. My name is James McCarthy. I served in the United States Army from 1943 to 1946, and I never fired a shot in combat. My war was fought with ice cream and Coca-Cola, with cigarettes and baseball games, with humanity in a place designed to hold the inhuman. This is the story of what I saw when the fighting stopped and the real war began, the war for men's souls. Fought one cold Coca-Cola Achatimi. They told us we'd be guarding monsters. That's what the training sergeant said at Fort Leonard Wood in the spring of 1945. Monsters in human skin, he called them. Men who'd burned Europe to ash, who'd followed a madman into hell and dragged the whole world with them. Our job was simple. Keep them contained, keep them fed, keep them alive until someone figured out what to do with them. I arrived at Camp Concordia on June 15th, 1945. The camp sprawled across the Kansas prairie like a small city, hundreds of barracks arranged in perfect military precision, surrounded by barbed wire and watch. It could hold 4,000 men. By the time I got there, it held close to 5,000, with more arriving every week. German prisoners of war, captured in France, in Belgium, in the final desperate days as the Reich collapsed. The first thing that struck me wasn't the prisoners. It was the heat. Kansas in June is an oven, the kind of heat that makes your uniform stick to your skin and turns your throat to sandpaper. The second thing that struck me was the smell, not unpleasant, just different. Wood smoke and canvas, disinfected in sweat, thousands of men living in close quarters under a merciless sun. The third thing that struck me was how young they looked. I'd expected hardened warriors, fanatics with iron in their eyes. What I got was boys, some younger than me, with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, wearing uniforms that hung loose on frames that had once been stronger. They moved slowly in the heat, conserving energy, their faces blank, masks of exhaustion and defeat. Sergeant Morrison gave me the tour my first day. He was Korea Army, a lifer who'd served in the First World War and signed up again when this one started. He walked with a limp from shrapnel in his hip, and he spoke about the prisoners with a strange mixture of contempt and pity. We have 3,842 krauts as of this morning, he told me, as we walked past a group of prisoners carrying lumber for a new latrine. Most of them were Wehrmacht, regular army, some Luftwaffe flyboys, a few SS, but we keep those separated, different animal entirely. I watched the prisoners work, their movements mechanical and efficient despite their obvious exhaustion. They didn't look at us as we passed, didn't acknowledge our presence at all. Do they speak English? I asked. Some do. Most don't. Doesn't matter much. They know the routine. Wake at 6, roll call at 6:30, work details from 7 to noon, lunch, more work from 1 to 5. Dinner Aichi, 6 lights out at 9. Same as any other army. Really? Just with different flags. What kind of work? Whatever needs doing. Farm work, mostly we're in the middle of wheat country, and the farmers around here lost half their workforce to the draft. The prisoners pick crops, mend fences, repair equipment. Some of them work in the camp itself, kitchen duty, maintenance, that sort of thing. They're paid for it too. 80 cents a day in camp script. They can buy cigarettes, toiletries, candy at the canteen. That surprised me. I'd expected something harsher, more punitive. This sounded almost ... civilized. Geneva Convention, Morrison explained, reading my expression. We treat them the way we'd want our boys treated if the situation were reversed. 3 meals a day, medical care, male privileges, recreational time. Hell, we even have a damn library for them. He stopped and turned to face me, his expression serious. But don't mistake kindness for weakness, son. These men are the enemy. They may be defeated, they may be broken, but they're still the enemy. You keep your distance, you follow protocol, and you never, ever forget what they represent. Understood? I nodded, but I wasn't sure I did understand. Looking at those exhausted, half-starved men shuffling through the compound, it was hard to see enemies. They just looked like prisoners, like anyone would look after years of war and months of captivity. That night, lying in my bunk in the guard barracks, I thought about Morrison's words. Keep your distance. Don't forget what they represent. It seemed simple enough, but I'd learn in the weeks to come that nothing about this place was simple. That the line between enemy and human being was thinner than barbed wire and twice as easy to cross. The routine came quickly. Up at 5:30, coffee and breakfast in the mess hall. Morning roll call at 6:45 to count the guards, then deployment to our assigned posts. Mine was Tower 7, overlooking the northeast corner of the compound where the recreational area met the main barracks section. From up there 20 feet above the ground, I could see everything. The prisoners moving between buildings, gathering in small groups in the exercise yard, queuing for meals at the mess hall. I could see the whole architecture of captivity laid out below me like a diagrammed barbed wire perimeter. The guard tower is spaced at regular intervals, the open ground between the fence and the barracks that we called the killing zone. Though, God willing, we'd never have to use it for that purpose. My shift was 8 hours, 8 to 4, with a 30-minute break for lunch that I took in the tower, eating the sandwich I'd brought from breakfast while watching the prisoners below eat theirs. The M1 carbine they'd issued me rested against the tower wall, loaded but with the safety on. I'd qualified with it in basic training, but rounds through paper targets shaped like men. But sitting up there in the Kansas heat, watching real men move through real lives below me, the rifle felt like a prop from a play I didn't want to perform. The other guards talked about the prisoners like they were livestock. Krauts and Jerrys and Nazis, always in that dismissive tone that made them less than human, easier to categorize and contain. But from up in that tower, watching them day after day, I started to see patterns that made them human again. There was the tall one who always walked alone, hands clasped behind his back, pacing the perimeter of the exercise yard like he was measuring it. There was the group of 5 who played cards every afternoon in the shade of the barracks, using stones for chips, and arguing in rapid German over hands I couldn't see. There was the young kid couldn't have been more than 18 who sat by himself and drew in a notebook for hours, his pencil moving across the pages in careful, deliberate strokes. And there was Klaus, though I didn't know his name yet. I just knew him as the man who stood at the fence every morning at 9 o'clock and stared west toward nothing, his hands gripping the wire until his knuckles went white. What's he looking at? I asked Morrison one day when he climbed up to check on me. Morrison glanced down at Klaus, then shrugged. Home? Probably. They all do that. Looking at something that ain't there anymore. Where's he from? How the hell should I know? Germany. Same as the rest of them. But it bothered me, that daily ritual, the intensity of it. The way Klaus would stand there for exactly 20 minutes, never more, never less, staring at the flat Kansas horizon like he could see through distance and time to whatever he'd left behind. The ice cream machine arrived on July 3rd, 1945. I remember the date because it was the day before Independence Day. And there was a strange irony in it, America celebrating its freedom by serving ice cream to men we'd taken that freedom from. It came on a truck from Fort Leavenworth, a beautiful piece of machinery that looked like something from a diner, all chrome and white enamel. The prisoners watched from behind the wire as we unloaded it, their faces blank but their eyes tracking every movement. They'd seen plenty of American equipment trucks and jeeps and weapons, but this was different. This was civilian. This was peacetime luxury in a world that had forgotten what luxury meant. Captain Bradley made the announcement at evening roll call. Starting tomorrow, in honor of Independence Day, we'll be serving ice cream twice a week to all prisoners who've maintained good conduct. This is a privilege, not a right, and it can be revoked at any time. You'll receive 1 scoop per serve-in. Flavors will vary based on availability. The prisoners stood in their neat ranks, faces impassive. If they understood what had been said, they didn't show it. But I saw something flicker in a few eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or disbelief. That night, I heard them talking in the barracks. Low voices in German, rising and falling like waves. I didn't speak the language, but I could hear the tone skeptical, wondering, almost fearful, like they were trying to figure out what the catch was, what price would be extracted for this small luxury. The next morning, July 4 Tega dawned clear and hot. By noon, the temperature was pushing 95 degrees. The prisoners worked their morning details sluggishly, moving through the heat like men underwater. At lunch, they ate their standard rations bread, soup, some kind of meat that might have been beef or might have been something else. None of us were sure. Then, at 2 o'clock, we rolled the ice cream machine out to the recreation yard. The line formed slowly, suspiciously. The prisoners approached like the machine might explode, glancing at the guards, watching each other, trying to read the situation. The first man to reach the machine was older, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and sergeant's stripes still faintly visible on his jacket where they'd been removed. He held out his hand, and Private Wilson, who'd been assigned ice cream duty, scooped vanilla into a cone and handed it over. The Joman took it carefully, like it might break. He looked at it for a long moment, then Hachiwuson, then back at the cone. Then he took a small, cautious bite. His eyes closed just for a second, but I saw it from my position near the fence. His whole body seemed to relax. Some tension I hadn't known he was carrying draining out of him all at once. He took another bite, bigger this time, and then he was eating it properly. Not fast, but steady, savoring every lick. The line moved faster after that, cone after cone, scoop after scoop, vanilla, because that's all we had that first day. The prisoners took them with expressions ranging from wonder to suspicion to something that looked almost like grief. That's when I saw Klaus. He was near the end of the line, standing stiff and uncertain. When his turn came, he accepted the cone with both hands, cradling it like something precious. He didn't move away to eat it. He just stood there, 5 feet from the machine, staring at the white cream already starting to melt in the heat. I walked over, curious, close enough to see his face clearly. He was younger than I'd thought, maybe 20, with blue eyes that looked older than the rest of him and a scar running from his left eyebrow into his hairline. "It's just ice cream," I said, not knowing if he spoke English. "You should eat it before it melts." He looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Not hatred or resentment, not even gratitude, just confusion, pure, unfiltered confusion. "Ice cream," he repeated slowly, the words awkward in his mouth. His English was better than I'd expected. We had ice cream. Before my mother made it, sometimes in the summer when there was milk and sugar. Before the war. He looked down at the cone again, and that's when the tears started. Silent, steady, tracking down his cheeks. He made no move to wipe them away. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "The war is over. We lost. You won. So why? Why this?" I didn't have an answer. Hell, I didn't understand it myself. But standing there, watching this German soldier cry over vanilla ice cream while the Kansas sun beat down on both of us, I felt something shift in my chest. Some wall I'd built, crumbling just a little. "Because we're not monsters," I said finally. "Neither are you." He looked at me for a long moment, then took a bite of the ice cream, then another. Then he was eating it properly, tears still running down his face, mixing with the vanilla dripping down his hand. When he finished, he wiped his face with his sleeve and looked at me again. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the ice cream. For," he gestured vaguely, unable to find the words, "for remembering we are men." Then he walked away, leaving me standing there in the heat, my rifle slung over my shoulder, wondering what the hell kind of war we'd been fighting. After that day, everything changed. Not in any way you could point to. On paper, the routine stayed the same. The rules stayed the same. The wire between us stayed firmly in place. But something invisible had shifted. Some barrier had thinned. The prisoners started talking to us more. Not all of them. Some remained distant and cold, locked in their own worlds of defeat and loss, but others began to engage tentatively at first, testing the waters to see if we'd bite. Klaus was one of them. After the ice cream incident, he sought me out when I was on tower duty, standing below and looking up. "May I practice English?" he called up in his careful, accented voice. "Sure," I called back. "What do you want to talk about?" "Anything. Everything. I need to remember how to speak to the world." So we talked in fragments and broken conversations, with me shouting down from the tower and him shouting up from below. We built something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't quite enmity either. Some third thing that existed only in that strange space between victory and defeat. He told me about his home, a small town in Bavaria whose name I couldn't pronounce, with mountains and forests and a river that ran green in summer. He told me about his mother, who'd worked as a seamstress and sang while she worked. He told me about his father, killed in the First World War when Klaus was just a baby, a man he'd never known but whose absence had shaped his entire life. He didn't talk about the Nazi Party, didn't talk about Hitler or the war crimes or any of the things I'd been taught made Germans into monsters. When I finally worked up the courage to ask, why did you fight? Why did you follow them? He just looked at me with those old, tired eyes and said, because it was that or die. And when you are young and afraid, you tell yourself that what you're doing is right. You tell yourself lies until the lies become truth. And by the time you realize they were lies all along, it's too late. You're already stained. He showed me his notebook one, day the one I'd seen him writing in. It was full of sketches. Not of the camp or the guards or anything military, just memories. A street corner in his hometown, a cat sleeping in a window, his mother's hands threading a needle. Images of a world that had been destroyed and that he was trying desperately to preserve on paper before he forgot what it looked like. I asked him once about the ice cream, why it had affected him so deeply. We stood there in the recreation yard, speaking quietly while other prisoners played volleyball nearby, their shouts and laughter creating a strange soundtrack to our conversation. In the last year of the war, he said slowly, we had nothing. No food but what we could steal or scavenge. No clean water. No medicine. Men died from infection because we had no antibiotics. Boys of 16 fought with rifles they didn't know how to use and died screaming from mothers who were already dead. And through it all, we were told we were winning. That victory was just around the corner. That sacrifice was noble. He paused, looking out across the compound at nothing. Then we were captured, and we expected to be killed. That's what we were told would happen, that the Americans and British were as brutal as we had been, that they would show no mercy. We expected torture and starvation and we expected to pay for what we had done. He turned to look at me directly. Instead, you gave us ice cream. You gave us Coca-Cola and cigarettes and baseball games. You treated us like prisoners of war instead of war criminals. You showed us what we had been fighting against, not monsters, but men, good men. Men who remembered mercy even when they had every right to forget it. He gestured around the camp, at the neat barracks and the volleyball net, and the prisoners walking freely within the wire. This place, he said quietly, is the first time in 5 years I have felt human, and that is more terrifying than anything else, because it means I must face what I stopped being, what we all stopped being. I didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to a man confronting his own lost humanity? How do you respond to that kind of raw honesty? So I just nodded and changed the subject. Asked him about his sketches, let him show me the latest drawings in his notebook. But his words stayed with me, echoing in my head long after our conversation ended. The Coca-Cola arrived in mid-July, cases and cases of it trucked in from Kansas City. The prisoners had never seen anything like it, the distinctive bottles, the red and white labels, the fizzy sweetness that was quintessentially American. We set up a canteen in one of the recreation buildings, selling the Coke for 5 cents in camp script. The prisoners could earn script through work details, following Geneva Convention guidelines, 80 cents a day for regular labor. Some saved it for cigarettes or writing paper. Others spent it immediately on small luxuries that reminded them they were still alive. The first time Klaus tried Coca-Cola, he took one sip and started laughing. Not bitter or sarcastic laughter, but genuine amusement, the kind that makes your whole body shake. What is this? He asked, holding the bottle up to examine it. It tastes like medicine and sugar and ... I don't know, like America, I suppose. Too sweet and too strong and absolutely ridiculous. But he kept drinking it. They all did. By the end of the first week, we were selling 300 bottles a day. The prisoners would sit in the shade of the barracks or under the cottonwood trees in the recreation yard, drinking their Cokes and talking in low voices, creating small moments of normalcy in an abnormal world. I started bringing a Coke up to the tower with me for my afternoon shift. Klaus would often be below, and I'd toss him a bottle if the other guards weren't looking. It was against regulations for fraternization. They called it But after weeks of watching these men exist in their strange half-life of captivity, regulation seemed less important than humanity. We'd drink our cokes in companionable silence, him on the ground and me in the tower. Separated by 20 feet of Kansas air and the invisible weight of the war, we'd both survived. "Tell me about Iowa," he said one afternoon. "What is it like?" "Flat," I said. "Like Kansas, but with more corn. Small towns where everyone knows everyone. Friday night football games, church on Sundays, nothing special." "It sounds perfect," he said quietly. "It's boring as hell. Boring is perfect. Boring means no one is dying. Boring means tomorrow will come and be exactly like today. After what we have seen, boring sounds like paradise." He had a point. What I'd spent my whole life trying to escape the predictability and monotony of small-town Iowa suddenly seemed like the greatest luxury imaginable. The luxury of knowing tomorrow would come, of having a tomorrow to know. "What will you do?" I asked, "when they send you home, when this is all over?" He was quiet for a long time, sipping his Coke and staring at nothing. "I don't know if there is a home to go back to," he said finally. "The last letter I received from my mother was in January 1945. Nothing since the town where I grew up was in the path of the Soviet advance. It may not exist anymore. She may not exist anymore." He took another drink, and I saw his hand trembling slightly. "But if there is still a world to return to, I think I will draw everything I can remember that was beautiful. Every street corner and flower garden and child's face. I will draw until my hands forget how to hold a weapon and remember only how to hold a pencil. I will draw beauty until the ugliness fades. What if it doesn't fade? Then I will draw it anyway. Because the alternative is to let the ugliness win. And we have let it win for too long already." We finished our cokes in silence, the afternoon heat pressing down on both of us. Somewhere in the compound, someone was singing a German folk song, the melody rising and falling like a bird in flight. Other voices joined in, creating harmony out of captivity. From my tour, I watched the prisoners gather around the singer, their faces turned toward the music like flowers toward sun. For a moment, they weren't enemies or prisoners or even Germans. They were just men, remembering what it felt like to be human. And I realized that's what the ice cream and Coca-Cola had been for. Not kindness, exactly, though there was kindness in it. Not strategy, though there was strategy too. But memory, helping these men remember what they'd forgotten in the machinery of war that sweetness existed. That small pleasures mattered, that humanity wasn't something you could stamp out completely, no matter how hard the world tried. August brought new prisoners. The camps in Europe were being closed down, the prisoners redistributed to facilities in the States where they could be put to work helping with the harvest. Camp Concordia swelled to nearly 6,000 men. The barracks packed tight, new faces appearing every day. These newer arrivals were different from the original prisoners. Harder, somehow. Marie? Broken. Many had been captured in the final desperate weeks of the war, fighting in the ruins of Berlin or the mountains of Bavaria against impossible odds. They came with stories that made Klaus's experiences seem almost gentle by comparison. There was Franz, who'd been part of the Volkssturm Hitler's last-ditch army of old men and boys pressed into service in the final months. He was 15 when they handed him a rifle and sent him to defend a city that was already lost. He was 16 when the Americans captured him, trying to surrender while SS officers shot deserters behind him. There was Otto, a Luftwaffe pilot, who'd flown missions until the fuel ran out and the plane stopped coming. He'd walked out of the war with nothing but his flight suit and a photograph of his wife and daughter, both killed in the bombing of Dresden. There was Werner, who wouldn't talk at all, just sat in the corner of the barracks, staring at his hands, rocking slowly back and forth. Shell shock, the camp doctor said, or something worse, something that didn't have a name yet. These men didn't know how to react to ice cream and coke. Some rejected it outright, suspicious of American generosity, convinced it was a trick or a test. Others took it with a kind of desperate hunger that was painful to watch, eating and drinking like they were trying to fill holes that food could never fill. Klaus took it upon himself to help them adjust. I'd watch from the tower as he moved among the new arrivals, talking quietly, translating when needed, explaining the routine and the rules. He became a bridge between the old prisoners who'd learned how to exist in this strange limbo and the new ones, who were still fighting the war in their heads. One evening, after my shift ended, I found Klaus sitting alone by the fence, his notebook open but empty, pencil held loosely in his hand. "Can't draw?" I asked, sitting down a few feet away, careful to maintain the regulation distance, even though there was no one around to see. "I can draw," he said. "I just don't know what to draw anymore. Everything feels ... small. Inadequate. How do you capture what those men have seen? How do you draw horror without becoming it?" "You don't," I said. "You draw what comes after. You draw healing, not hurt." "Is there healing after something like this?" "Has to be. Otherwise, what was the point?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The point was madness. The point was following a madman into hell and dragging civilization down with us. There was no point except destruction. "Then, make a new point," I said. "Make the point be rebuilding. Make the point be ice cream and Coca-Cola and small kindnesses that add up to something bigger." He looked at me for a long moment, then down at his blank page. "You are very young," he said, "but not as young as you should be. This war aged all of us in ways we will never recover from. So did you recover or give up?" He smiled, and tired but real. "I draw," he said simply. "Every day. I draw. That is how I know I have not given up yet." He put pencil to paper and began to sketch. I watched as an image took Shema a memory of home or a scene from before the war, but the view from where we sat, the fence, the watchtower, the barracks with laundry hanging on lines between them. Reality, captured in graphite and paper. "You're drawing the camp," I observed. "I am drawing what is, not what was." Perhaps that is where healing begins, accepting what is, even when what is includes barbed wire and guard towers. He continued sketching in the fading light, and I sat with him in companionable silence, watching the camp settle into evening. Somewhere in the barracks, someone was playing a harmonica, the notes floating across the compound like ghosts. September 12th, 1945, the day everything changed again. The announcement came during morning roll call. Germany has officially been divided into occupation zones. Captain Bradley read from the telegram he'd received. "Repatriation of prisoners will begin within the next 60 days. You'll be processed, documented, and sent home to your respective zones of occupation." The prisoners stood in their neat ranks, faces carefully neutral, but I could feel something ripple through them, relief and fear mixing into something complex and hard to name. Home. After years of war and months of captivity, they were going home. Except home didn't exist anymore. Not the way they remembered it. Germany was divided, occupied, destroyed. Cities were rubble. Families were scattered or dead. The country they'd fought for was gone, replaced by something new and uncertain and wholly unfamiliar. That afternoon, Klaus found me at the tower. "So," he called up, "it ends?" "Not yet. 2 months still. 2 months is nothing. A blink, and then I go back to whatever's left. You don't sound happy about it." He was quiet for a moment, squinting up at me through the afternoon sun. "I should be happy. I should be grateful. Instead, I am terrified. Here, I know what I am. I am a prisoner. Yes, but I am safe. I have food and water and shelter. I have time to think and draw and remember what it feels like to be human. Out there, ... He gestured vaguely eastward. "Out there. I don't know what I am. Or what I will find, or if there is anything to find at all." "You'll find something," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "People are resilient. Things rebuild." "Do they?" "After something like this. Can you rebuild from ashes?" Germany rebuilt after the last war? And look what we built. Look what we became. He shook his head. "Maybe some things should stay broken. Maybe we don't deserve to be put back together." That's survivor's guilt talking. You survived. That's not a crime, isn't it? When so many didn't? I didn't have an answer for that. How do you argue with a man's conscience? How do you convince someone they deserve to live when they've decided they don't? We stood in silence for a while, him on the ground and me in the tower, the familiar distance between us suddenly feeling much wider. "Will you write to me?" he asked suddenly. "After I leave, after this is over, will you remember me?" The question caught me off guard. We'd never discussed what happened after. The camp existed in a strange eternal present, where tomorrow was just another day exactly like today. The idea of after of this ending and us going our separate ways into completely different futures hadn't seemed real until that moment. "Yeah," I said, "yeah, I'll write. If you want me to, I want you to. I want to know that someone in America remembers that we were men, not monsters. That someone witnessed our humanity even in this place." He pulled out his notebook and tore out a page of the sketch he'd done of the camp that evening by the fence. He folded it carefully and held it up. For you. So you remember too. I climbed down from the tower, breaking protocol, and took the drawing. Our fingers touched briefly as he handed it over, and I felt the calluses on his hands, the evidence of labor and art both. Thank you, I said. No, thank you. For the ice cream, for the Coca-Cola, for the conversations, for treating us like we mattered. You did matter. You do matter. He smiled sadly. Perhaps we only matter now because we lost. History is written by the victors. Yes. And in your history, we will be the villains. Forever and always, we will be the monsters who had to be defeated. No matter how much ice cream you gave us, no matter how many bottles of Coca-Cola, we will always be the enemy. That's not fair. No, but it is true. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with his drawing in my hands, the paper soft and worn from being in his notebook for so long. I looked down at the sketch of the careful lines, the shading, the attention to detail that turned a prison camp into something almost beautiful, into a place where humans lived, even in captivity. I folded it carefully and put it in my breast pocket, over my heart. The next 2 months were strange. Everyone knew it was ending, that this strange interlude of ice cream and Coca-Cola and almost friendship was temporary. The prisoners walked with a new energy, anxious and uncertain, but undeniably present. The guards became more lenient, letting small infractions slide, acknowledging without words that there was no point in cruelty when everything was almost over. The ice cream kept coming. The Coca-Cola kept flowing. But now it felt different, not like kindness, but like farewell. Like we were trying to pack as much humanity as possible into the time remaining, knowing that once the prisoners left, they'd be returning to a world that might have none to spare. Klaus drew constantly. Every day, new sketches appeared in his notebook: the volleyball games, the guard towers, the men eating ice cream, the sunset over the Kansas prairie. He was documenting everything, preserving the memory of this strange place where enemies became something else. I found myself collecting small things too: a photograph someone took of the prisoners at recreation time, a newspaper clipping about the camp, a Coca-Cola bottle cap that Klaus had given me, saying, "Keep this. Remember that even in the worst of times, there was sweetness." On November 3rd, the first group left, 300 men loaded onto trains bound for Fort Dix in New Jersey, where they'd be processed for repatriation. Klaus wasn't in this group. His name was on the December manifest. But watching those men leave, seeing them look back at the camp with expressions mixing relief and regret, I understood what was coming. The camp felt emptier after they left. Not just physically there, we're still 5,000 men here, but emotionally. Some vital energy had drained away, replaced by the heavy weight of ending. Klaus was different now, quieter, more withdrawn. He still talked to me when I was on tower duty, but the conversations had lost their lightness. Everything was tinged with goodbye. "I've been thinking about what I'll do," he told me one afternoon in late November. The weather had turned cold, the Kansas wind cutting through our uniforms. "When I get home, if there is a home, and I'll find my mother, if she's alive. If the house still stands, and if she doesn't, I'll build something new. Not just a house, a life. Something that isn't about death and destruction. Something that proves we can be more than what we became." That sounds good. It sounds impossible. But what choice do I have? The alternative is despair, and I have seen where despair leads. Better to be foolishly hopeful than wisely defeated. He pulled out his notebook and showed me his latest drawing. It was different from the others, not a scene from the camp, but something imagined. A small house with flowers in the window, a woman standing in the doorway, her face in shadow, but her posture welcoming. A path leading through a garden to the door. "This is what I will build," he said. "This is what I will remember when everything else tries to pull me back into darkness. Ice cream and Coca-Cola and small kindnesses. That is what America taught me. That is what I will carry home." I looked at the drawing, at the hopeful impossibility of it, and felt something break in my chest. "You'll make it," I said. "You'll find your way. We both will," he said. "But we will never forget this place. How could we? This is where we learn to be human again." December 18th, 1945. The cold was brutal that morning, frost coating everything in white crystals that glittered like broken glass in the early light. The prisoners assembled in the main yard at dawn, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. 473 men, Klaus among them, ready to begin the journey home. They stood in formation one last time, wearing the same Wehrmacht uniforms they'd arrived in, now cleaned and mended as well as could be managed. Each man carried a small duffel with their possessions letters from home, photographs, drawings, the small treasures accumulated during months of captivity. Each man had been given a Red Cross parcel for the journey crackers and tinned meat and chocolate. Ironically, better rations than they'd had during most of the war. Captain Bradley gave a short speech in English that Morrison translated into German. "You have been prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You've been treated fairly and with respect. You are now being returned to your homeland. The United States expects you to rebuild your country as men of peace, not men of war. Go without hope that you will never have to fight again." The prisoners stood silent, their faces unreadable. "What do you say to that? Thank you for imprisoning us humanely. Thank you for the ice cream while our country burned." But then one man stepped forward. It was Otto, the Luftwaffe pilot. He saluted not the Nazi salute, but a proper military salute, crisp and respectful. "Thank you," he said in careful English, "for remembering we are men." One by one, other prisoners saluted. Not all of them. Some stood rigid and cold, unwilling to show gratitude to their captors. But enough to matter. Klaus found me before they loaded onto the trucks. He pressed his notebook into my hands. "I can't take this," I protested. "These are your drawings, your memories." "They are our memories now," he said. "Yours and mine both. Keep them. Remember what happened here. Tell people, if they will listen, tell them that even in war, even in the worst darkness, humanity survived. It survived an ice cream and Coca-Cola and small conversations between enemies who became something else." His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. "Not quite. I will write," he promised. "When I find my mother, when I build my little house with flowers in the window, I will write and tell you. And you will write back and tell me about Iowa, about the boring, beautiful predictability of peace." "I will," I said. "I promise." We shook hands. A simple gesture, but in that moment it felt like more. It felt like recognition, like acknowledgement that what had happened between USBT and all of us, guards and prisoners, that it had changed us in ways we were only beginning to understand. Then he was gone, climbing into the truck with the others, the canvas cover closing behind them. The trucks rumbled to life, diesel engines coughing in the cold air. I watched them drive through the gates, through the wire that had contained them for so long, out onto the open Kansas road that led east toward the trains, toward the ships, toward home. The camp fell hollow after they left. We still had prisoners more than 4,000, with another group scheduled to leave in January. But something essential had departed with that convoy, some proof that what we'd been doing mattered, that the ice cream and Coca-Cola had meant something more than just following regulations. That night, I opened Klaus's notebook, page after page of drawings, each one a moment preserved. The volleyball games, the guard towers, men eating ice cream with expressions of wonder, the fence at sunset, and on the last page, a drawing I hadn't seen before. It was me, standing in my tower, rifle slung over my shoulder, looking down with an expression I didn't recognize on my own face. Not the hardness I'd thought I wore, not the military authority I'd tried to project, but something softer, something almost kind. Underneath, in Klaus's careful handwriting, Guard Tower 7. The young man who gave me ice cream and remembered I was human. James McCarthy, Iowa, USA, never forget. I closed the notebook carefully and put it in my footlocker with his other drawings. The Coca-Cola bottle cap, the letters I'd started writing but never sent. Evidence that this had happened. That this strange, impossible friendship had existed, however briefly, in the space between war and peace. The letters started coming in February 1946. Not from Klaus, not yet, but from others. Franz wrote from the British zone in Germany, describing the ruins of Hamburg and his attempts to find work in a city where half the buildings were rubble. Otto wrote from Bavaria, where he'd found his wife's sister alive and was living in a displaced person's camp while trying to rebuild some kind of life. Werner never wrote. I learned from Otto's letter that he'd walked into the Danube River one night in January and hadn't come back out. Some wounds, Otto wrote, are too deep for ice cream to heal. Some darkness cannot be sweetened with Coca-Cola. We tried to save him, but he was already gone long before he died. I wrote back to the ones who wrote to me, stilted, awkward letters at first, not sure what to say to men I'd guarded. men who'd been my enemies. But gradually, the words came easier. I told him about Iowa, about the farm I'd returned to, about the corn growing tall in the summer heat and the county fair in September. I told them the boring, beautiful details of peacetime, and they wrote back with their own detailed small triumphs and large setbacks. The slow, painful process of rebuilding lives from ashes. Klaus's letter arrived in April 1946. The envelope was thin, the paper inside covered in his careful handwriting. I sat on the porch of my family's farmhouse to read it, the spring sun warm on my face, the smell of turned earth and growing things in the air. Dear James, it began, I am alive. I am home, though home is a word that means something different now than it did before. He'd found his mother. She'd survived the Soviet advance, hidden in a cellar with 3 other families for 2 weeks while the fighting raged above. Their house was damaged but standing. The town was occupied now, Soviet soldiers on every corner, the population reduced by half through death and displacement. We are rebuilding, he wrote. Slowly, with materials scavenged from ruins and hope borrowed from memory, I have begun drawing again, not just memories but plans. Plans for buildings, for gardens, for futures that may never come but that we must imagine anyway, or else despair wins. The ice cream you gave me, James, I think about it often. Not because it was ice cream, but because of what it represented. You could have treated us as less than human. You would have been justified in doing so after what our country did, what our leaders ordered, what we allowed to happen. But instead, you gave us ice cream. You reminded us that civilization survives in small gestures, that humanity persists in sweetness, that even enemies can remember each other's essential dignity. I am trying to live in a way that honors that lesson. Some days, I succeed. Most days, I fail, but I keep trying, and that, I think, is what matters. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for the ice cream and the Coca-Cola and the conversations from Tower 7. Thank you for seeing me as a man when I had almost forgotten how to be one. Your friend, Klaus. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket, next to the Coca-Cola bottle cap I still carried. Around me, Iowa stretched out in all directions, flat and green and impossibly peaceful. My younger brother was working in the field, guiding the tractor in straight lines through the black earth. My mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. My father was repairing the barn roof, hammer blows echoing across the farm. Normal, boring, beautiful. And somewhere across the ocean, in the ruins of Bavaria, Klaus was drawing, planning, rebuilding, carrying the memory of ice cream and cocoa into a future none of us could quite imagine yet. I stayed in touch with Klaus for years. His letters came regularly, charting the slow resurrection of Germany from its own ashes. He met a woman, a widow with a young son whose husband had died in the fighting They married in 1948 in a church that had been rebuilt stone by the townspeople. He sent me a photograph of the wedding, him in a borrowed suit, her in a simple dress, both of them smiling with a hope that looked hard-won and precious. They opened a small shop, art supplies and stationery, serving the slowly recovering community. Klaus taught drawing classes to children who'd grown up knowing only war, showing them how to see beauty, how to create instead of destroy. He never stopped drawing himself. Every letter included a small sketch of the rebuilding town, his stepson playing in the street, the view from his shop window. In 1952, he wrote to tell me his mother had died peacefully in her sleep. She lived to see the shop open, he wrote. She lived to see me build something instead of destroy something. She lived to taste ice cream again. He made sure of that. I found a way to make it. Found the sugar and cream and ice. And we sat together on the porch of our rebuilt house and ate it slowly, savoring every bite, remembering that sweetness exists even after bitterness tries to kill it. Franz wrote less frequently, but his letters told a similar story of slow, painful reconstruction. He'd become a teacher, working with orphans in Hamburg, trying to give them the child the war had stolen. It's hard, he wrote, to teach hope to children who've seen their parents die, their homes destroyed, their futures stolen. But I try, and some days I succeed. And on those days I remember to ice cream and think, maybe we can rebuild more than just buildings. Maybe we can rebuild souls. Otto stopped writing in 1953. I never knew why. Part of me hopes he found peace, built a life so complete he no longer needed to reach back to the past. Part of me fears the darkness caught up with him, the way it caught Werner. I'll never know, and maybe that's appropriate. Some stories don't get neat endings. I tried to explain it to my wife once, years later. We were married in 1949, had 3 children by 1955, built a good life on that Iowa farm. She knew I'd served in the war, knew I'd been a guard at a PO, but she didn't understand why I kept those letters, why I treasured that notebook of drawings, why I still carried that Coca-Cola bottle cap in my pocket 20 years later. I served ice cream to German prisoners, I told her, and watched them cry, and learned that humanity is more fragile and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. That's what the war taught me, not how to fight, but how to remember that enemies are still human. That kindness matters even when it seems pointless. That ice cream can be revolutionary when given at the right moment to the right person. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. And maybe I was... How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it felt like to watch a grown man weep over vanilla ice cream? How do you convey the weight of those moments when the wire between us seemed almost transparent, when German and American mattered less than human and human? Klaus's last letter arrived in 1987, 42 years after that July day when ice cream first appeared in Camp Concordia. He was 70 years old, still drawing, still teaching, still building. His stepson had become an architect, designing buildings for the new reunified Berlin that seemed possible now that the wall was coming down. His wife had passed away the year before, peacefully, surrounded by family. "I am an old man now," he wrote, "and the war feels both impossibly distant and terribly close. I can barely remember the boy I was when I joined the Ver, full of fear and confused patriotism and desperate desire to survive. But I remember clearly the man I was in your camp, broken and lost, staring at ice cream and wondering how the world could still contain such sweetness after such bitter. You saved my life, James. Not by guarding me, though, you did that. Not by feeding me, though, you did that too. But by treating me like a human being when I had forgotten that's what I was. The ice cream wasn't just ice cream. The Coca-Cola wasn't just Coca-Cola. They were proof that civilization survives, that kindness persists, that even in the darkest times, there are still people who remember how to be good. I've thought about this a lot as I've grown older. Watching Germany rebuild, watching my stepson design buildings for a future that looks nothing like the past we came from. And I've realized something. The war didn't end in 1945. It ended in small moments across years and decades every time someone chose kindness over cruelty, humanity over hatred, building over destroying. It ended every time I chose to draw beauty instead of dwelling in darkness. Every time I taught a child to see wonder instead of horror. Every time I tasted ice cream and remembered that sweetness exists. The war ended, James. Not with treaties and surrenders, but with ice cream and Coca-Cola and small acts of remembering that we're all human. That's what you taught me. That's what I've tried to teach others. That's what I hope survives long after. We're both going to understanding that humanity persists in the smallest gestures and that those gestures matter more than all the grand declarations and military victories. Thank you, my friend, for everything, for the ice cream, for the conversations, for remembering me. Your friend always, Klaus, he died 3 months later. His stepson wrote to tell me, included a photograph from the funeral. Dozens of people, students, friends, families gathered around a grave in that small Bavarian town that had been destroyed and rebuilt. Torn down and reconstructed so many times it was barely recognizable as the place Klaus had left in 1943. But it was home. He'd made it home. He'd taken the ashes and built something from them. He'd taken the memory of ice cream and Coca-Cola and turned it into a philosophy, a way of living, a reminder that sweetness survives. I'm 93 years old now, writing this in 2018. 73 years after I first saw a German prisoner cry over vanilla ice cream. The world has changed in ways I couldn't have imagined back then. Germany is unified, prosperous, a leader in Europe. The Cold War came and went. New wars started, and some ended, and some still rage, because humans never quite learn the lessons history tries to teach. But I remember Klaus and Franz and Otto and Werner and the thousands of other men who passed through Camp Concordia. Kansas, in those months after the war ended, but before peace truly began. I remember their faces when they tasted ice cream for the first time in years. I remember their wonder at Coca-Cola, their gradual relaxation as they realized we weren't going to kill them, weren't going to starve them, weren't going to treat them as less than human. I still have Klaus's notebook, though the pages are yellowed now and the pencil drawings are fading. I still have the letters tied with string in a box in my closet. I still have that Coca-Cola bottle cap, worn smooth from decades of being carried in my pocket. And I still have the memory vivid as yesterday of that first afternoon, watching Klaus stare at ice cream like it was a miracle. Watching tears run down his face, hearing him ask why, when we'd won and they'd lost, we would show them kindness. I didn't have a good answer then, but I do now, after 70 years of thinking about it, because humanity isn't something you turn on and off based on who's winning or losing. Because kindness isn't a strategic calculation, but a choice we make about who we want to be. Because ice cream and Coca-Cola, those small, sweet, ridiculous luxuries, are proof that civilization survives even in the darkest times. That we can be more than our worst moments. That enemies can become friends, or at least something like friends. If we remember that beneath the uniforms and flags and ideologies, we're all just humans trying to survive in a world that keeps trying to tear us apart. The war taught me how to guard prisoners, but the prisoners taught me how to be human. That's the real story. That's what I want people to remember when they think about those camps. Those men, that strange interlude between war and peace. We gave them ice cream, and they gave us back our humanity. That's the trade. That's the gift. That's what survives long after the treaties are signed and the soldiers go home and the camps are torn down and turned back into Kansas prairie. Ice cream melts. Coca-Cola loses its fizz. But the memory of sweetness in bitter times that lasts forever. My children ask me sometimes why I keep that old notebook, those fading letters, that worn bottle cap. Why I get teary-eyed when I see vanilla ice cream or hear a Coca-Cola bottle open with that distinctive hiss. Why I insist on telling this story to anyone who will listen, even though most people don't want to hear about German prisoners being treated kindly. They want their war's simple heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys, clear moral lines, but war isn't simple. It's the most complicated thing humans do to each other. And the only way through that complexity is to hold on to the small, simple truths that kindness matters, that humanity persists, that ice cream can save a soul when given at the right moment with the right intention. I served ice cream to German prisoners in the summer of 1945. I watched them cry and laugh and slowly remember how to be human. I became friends with men I'd been trained to hate. And in doing so, I learned the most important lesson of my life, that the enemy is just another human being who happened to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time, told the wrong lies, caught in the wrong machinery. And if you give them ice cream, if you show them basic human kindness, they remember who they really are. Not Germans, not Nazis, not enemies, just men. Just humans. Just people trying to survive and rebuild and find some sweetness in a world that's been too bitter for too long. That's what I want people to remember. Not the dates or the battles or the grand sweep of history, but the small moments. The ice cream cone melting in the July heat. The Coca-Cola bottle passed through wire. The drawing given as a gift. The letter written across an ocean. The memory of sweetness persisting in bitter times. Because that's what survives. That's what matters. That's what makes us human in the end, not the wars we fight, but the kindness we show. Not the enemies we defeat, but the humanity we preserve. I saw German prisoners stare in disbelief at the ice cream and Coca-Cola we served in the camps. I watched them remember what sweetness tasted like. I witnessed their slow return to humanity, one small kindness at a time. And in their eyes, I saw the reflection of my own humanity. The war didn't end when the fighting stopped. It ended when we looked at each other across the wire and remembered we were both human. That's the story. That's what I lived. That's what I'll carry with me to my grave. Ice cream and Coca-Cola. Small kindnesses in dark times. Humanity persisting against all odds. That's the war one fought. And God willing, that's the war I won.